Shane.
So I need to set up my studio.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, Nick, I just sent you the link to the virtual meetup from this week. If you want me to announce that in some other channels, I'm happy to. It was live at like midnight, so I just haven't sent it out yet.
Why didn't you wake me up?
Sorry, I wasn't awake either.
Y'all ready to get started? Don't all talk at once.
Yes.
Good.
Okay. Hey everybody, so thanks for joining. Today we're going to do a few of the kind of standard open hour things, and then we're going to launch into a testing clinic for most of this session. So as far as housekeeping kind of updates, I don't have a whole lot right now. We do have weekly meetups, weekly virtual meetups. The first one of those starts next week, April 8th at, I think it's 11 a.m. Mountain Time. But that's going to be Tom Hatch is going to do a talk on an intro to plugin oriented programming. After that, the following couple meetups will be kind of a deeper dive into POP. So for people who are interested, those are meetups that are going to be starting. And right now we have virtual meetups scheduled through about mid-May. And then after that, I'm working on lining up some other speakers. The other thing we're doing, and this is in early stages, but we are doing a Twitch stream on Tuesdays and Thursdays midday. Right now it's kind of experimental, but we'll be running through things like triage or just kind of what people are working on day to day. So SaltStack Inc. is our Twitch page if anybody wants to follow that. And that's all I have for housekeeping and connection items. Anybody else? All right, Megan, you're up talking about 3001 release in Sodium.
Okay, yeah, so we just released 3000.1, as everybody probably saw yesterday. One thing to note is we are a bit delayed on the Raspberry Pi packages. This is just because we've had to move some hardware to individuals' homes since everybody is working from home, so we had to figure some of that out. So we didn't want that to delay the release. So it is now in the QA phase right now. It's been built. So hopefully that gets out this week, if not next week. So yeah, for this 3001 release, you can take a look at the changelog, and you can see all of the issues that were fixed, but I can just highlight a couple of them really quickly. The mine data was fixed. A couple users ran into issues with the mine data being changed. Data if.
Oh no, Megan, you're cutting in and out. And now she's frozen. It's a talent, really.
A talent? Okay. What?
You were cutting in and out, and then you were frozen.
Oh, sorry, my internet. I'm getting a new modem, but they won't let me get it at the store, so I have to wait 5 days for it. So my internet keeps going in and out. So apologies. What was the last thing you heard?
What was the
changes the mine data?
Okay. All right. Perfect. Yeah. So there was also some MySQL fixes that were put in. Let's see. Let's highlight a couple of other. There were some issues with versioning since we changed to the new version. Things like the grain data wasn't returning the correct version. That was fixed this release. There was some LGPO fixes that were added. And yeah, that kind of sums it up. You guys can definitely take a look at all of the changes in the changelog. If you have any questions, definitely reach out to us. So that's it for 3000.1. I would like to say that now that 3000.1 is out, we are merging in features again. which is great. So you can definitely take a look at your PRs, see if that needs any rebasing or anything like that. So we can try to get that merged in for you. And also, if anyone noticed, we are removing Python 2 tests on Jenkins. You can probably see that if you just go to Jenkins right now. I think the tests are still there, but they're not running right now. And that will be the case for pull requests as well, since we are dropping Python 2 support for Sodium. So that's exciting. Yeah, so that's it for 3000.1. And then they wanted me to go over just kind of what our focuses are going to be for the Sodium release. And so I'll kind of just go through a couple of the highlights that we're working towards. A lot of things we're trying to improve on is community. So I know that Cassandra is working on a website so that there's a central location for everybody to see things like release timelines, product updates, links to resources, and so forth. And I think that's community.saltsack.com that she is working towards. Okay, perfect. So that is one of our big pushes this release, to get that done. We're also working on Tornado 6 and 5 support to be added in this release. Another thing we're trying to attempt to do is to reduce the PR backlog, because that's getting a bit high, and also to finish up the PR ports from the other branches like Neon and Develop into Master. Gareth did a bunch of work around that. And so I think you narrowed the list down to about 500, Gareth, that are left. Is that right?
So the list is down to just under 500. I think 494. And of the 494, about 200 can be automated in terms of merging. So that's about like almost 300 that we need to do manually.
Okay. Perfect. So that list was a lot smaller than we originally thought, because he discovered that a lot of the PRs we don't need to backport. They are things like skipping tests when we were doing some efforts towards getting tests green, and we were trying to skip tests and then unskip them to slowly fix them. And so those sort of things, and then a bunch of changes to like CI files that don't need to be ported as well. So that was kind of good news. That lowers that list by a lot. And another, not only do we want to get these ports to master completed internally, we're planning on setting up we're calling it a jam with the community. And so we would then work with the community and have them help us as well to maybe do pull request reviews or actually doing some of the ports to master, so that we can get everybody involved with this project so we can get that done. So that's a big project for this release that we're working towards. Another one is the Python 2 deprecation. There is some work that still needs to be done there. A lot of it is documentation so that users are aware of this big change and how it's going to affect them. We also discovered with the previous Python 2 deprecation step that we stated we would be supporting Python 3.4, because at the time 3.4 was going to not be deprecated when we were originally planning on releasing Sodium. That's not the case anymore. 3.4 has been deprecated since last year. So I'm working on a step right now to update our Python version support, particularly for Sodium, and to kind of define what it looks like going forward. And then Salt SSH is going to need to be updated so that it can work against minions that don't have Python 3 installed on them. So that's a big task for Sodium as well. Let's see. Another thing we want to improve on is the triage process. there's some inconsistencies with that. We did have the discussion as to what does the triage process look like right now, but we still need to have the discussion for this release as to what we need to make it look like so that we can improve on it, and that it's more clear to a community member or anybody when they submit an issue, whether that's going to be fixed by us soon for a particular release, or it's up to the community to fix, and things like that. So we want to make that clear and make the process clear as well. So that's in the works. Yeah, I think that's kind of the big highlights there. I know we're also doing a lot of focus around improving the test runs, but we haven't defined exactly what those tasks look like yet. So that's something we're going to be working on in the next couple of weeks. Yeah, that's about it. Let me see if there's any questions. Not in the chat. If there's any questions, please feel free to speak up or post them in the chat.
Yeah, and that goes for the entirety of this meeting. That seems to be working really well with people just posting their questions in that chat, and then we answer them as questions come up. All right, Sage, it looks like you're talking a little bit more about PR assigned dashboard.
Yeah, just that it's there. I haven't done a ton of work there. I think that as we look at those 494 that still need ports to master, those may juggle a little bit. There's some that may take more priority. And so we want to take a look at those fairly carefully to make sure that we're hitting those PRs that are really the priority PRs. So there may be some juggling that happens on that board. And just to let you guys know that we want to look at the most important.
Cool. Anybody else have any general updates or announcements?
Just as a bit of an addendum to what Megan was talking about earlier with migrating PRs and things, we are looking to blacken the SALT code base, hoping to be able to get that finished today, and then we'll get that merged in. So that will require some updates on your part in any PRs that you've got, because the code base will have pretty much entirely changed by that point. But it also should be really simple, because part of it, part of the change is setting up Black as a pre-commit hook. If you've never used pre-commit, it's like kind of amazing. It's just a YAML file that you set up in your repository, and then it's a pip package that you install, and then you can run pre-commit install, I think it is, and then it will install the pre-commit hooks for Git. And it makes it pretty fantastic because it allows you to gate your commits on any type of criteria. So in our case, we have lint, and when we black and salt, black and isort for sorting the imports. So those three things will gate your commits. So that should basically eliminate any issues we have on PRs, because right now, I know a lot of times you'll like commit something and it'll just be like a little lint error, and you got to go in and fix your lint error and then recommit. But with using pre-commit, it'll allow us to sidestep all of that, because you won't even commit without making it your code look correct, at least for the lint and black steps. So that will should streamline our pull review process quite a bit, especially those little nitpicky items. We'll just completely eliminate those. So just something to be aware of.
Have we documented this process as part of your PR, like so that somebody knows they need to pip install it? And
we have some documentation. I don't know that it's part of that. I think we have merged already one for pre-commit that talks about how to install pre-commit, but I can double check and make sure that that's part of this PR, so that we have documentation as well to say go ahead and run pre-commit.
Okay. And then is there any community communications that we can do, Cassandra, once this is merged in, because this will require some work on any contributor's part?
Yeah, definitely. We can, you know, post an announcement, and if it's something that we want particular help with, we can maybe set up an event or bring it up in an open hour. But yep,
Okay,
definitely need to communicate those things.
awesome. Wayne, can you work with her on the messaging aspect?
Yeah, I can do that. That's all I had.
Cool. Anybody else have anything else to add? All right, then Wayne and Gareth, you're up with a testing clinic.
All right. So tests, everybody's favorite thing to do and a favorite subject, right? So I think probably one of the good places to start with is just to level set on our terminology. You know, if you ask 10 developers, what does unit test and integration tests and functional tests and other kinds of tests, what does testing mean? You're probably going to get 20 different opinions out of those 10 developers. And that's just kind of where we are in history today. So to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as testing and SALT goes, I think it's important to go ahead and actually define what do we mean when we say unit test versus functional test versus integration test. And so from our perspective, we've discussed this as a team a lot and kind of hash things around and hash things out and figured out, you know, kind of what does all of these terms mean for us. So from SALT's perspective, currently we are looking at 3 main types of tests, which we're calling unit test, functional test, and integration test. And they should be fairly similar to any definitions that you've heard of already. But in case they're not, unit testing, when we talk about unit testing, we are talking about testing a specific chunk of code. It's not necessary that a unit test mocks out different bits and pieces of external code, but it is definitely possible. And in our current code base today, a lot of the unit tests do mock things out. And some drawbacks of unit testing is that we might not be testing the actual code, or at least completely. We may be testing just a specific block. There are pitfalls around mocking. You may end up mocking too much. As a matter of fact, we've seen some examples of tests where somebody is mocking out the code and then they're basically just testing that their mock is mocked. And so that's definitely a big pitfall, something that can happen, especially as you're writing tests if you start to get carried away. I know I've done that myself, and then I look at it and go, wait, I'm not actually testing anything here. Maybe I need to rethink things. It can also sort of freeze implementation if your unit test mocks too many things and is really concerned more about the implementation versus the outcomes. Then you can really kind of write yourself into a corner, basically, where you have a test suite full of these unit tests that care about specifics of how you wrote the code, which can be a problem. So those are kind of the drawbacks and things that you've got to be careful with when writing unit tests. The benefits, of course, are that they're fast, right? A unit test, everything is in memory. You're not making network connections. You're not doing disk access. You're not making a database call. A unit test is going to be fast. It should be under 1/10 of a second. If not, then it's probably not really a unit test, because you've got too much other stuff going on. They're also very specific. If a unit test fails, it should tell you basically exactly what the problem is. So you don't have to wonder, okay, well, this test failed. What does that mean? It should pretty much tell you, oh, this test failed because I'm returning true instead of false. And then you can dig around and figure out exactly why that's happening. So that's, if you've ever heard of the test pyramid, this is kind of our test pyramid. So unit tests should be the majority of our tests. And we should get a pretty substantial amount of test coverage out of this. But we might not be testing the actual functionality of the system. So that's where we get our functional tests at. So when we say functional tests, that's probably one that's got a less common definition, I think. But for us, the term functional test is anything that's like actually talking to a database or the disk, doing stuff with the underlying file system, or running an actual command, doing a not mocking subprocess.run, but actually allowing that to call out. If that's happening, then it's at least going to be a functional test. The drawback there is that it's slower, right? Disk access is slow, network access is slow. And similar to the unit test, it's not maybe necessarily complete. It's testing a little bit more in isolation, but it is testing things a little bit at a little bit higher level. The biggest benefit to writing a functional test is it's going to expose if something on the underlying system changed. So with the unit test, if it's not actually communicating with a real program, for instance, if it's just mocking that the output, and a release happens and a new version of the code or that program is released and it has changes their API, all of a sudden the unit tests aren't going to detect that breaks, but a functional test is. So that's really the benefit there. They still should be pretty fast because they're not going to be doing the whole entire salt, start up a master, start up a minion, make the connection, exchange keys, run a command. It's not actually going to be doing that. So it's still going to be a little bit faster, but not quite as fast as the unit tests. And then when we talk about integration tests, we're going up to that level where you have a master, you have a minion or a set of minions, or maybe you're doing salt SSH or whatever it is, but you have this full environment set up, and we're doing the round trip communication there. Typically, we shouldn't have a lot of these integration tests. They should be, they should have a very specific purpose. We shouldn't be making 700 test calls, within the same module doing these integration tests. It should be pretty much, here's a specific scenario that we've seen or that we want to protect against. Spin this up, run the test, make sure it works, and then tear everything down. And so we should have a handful of those. But what that does is that does give us that full confidence that when we release salt, we don't release it with bugs. And one of the biggest and most important things with our integration tests that we should be doing is as we do release salt, when we see bugs happen in the wild, we should be writing an integration test that captures that bug so that the next time we make changes to salt, we know that we're not breaking that particular flow. And eventually we'll build up enough integration tests that we won't have any serious issues when we release salt. That's kind of the main goal there. When we make a salt release, we shouldn't have salt crash. We shouldn't have any data loss. There shouldn't be any kind of major errors or issues with salt when we release. And that's where those integration tests are really going to help out. So that's a bit of a terminology level set. Does that make sense to everybody? Is there any confusion there? Gareth, is there anything that you want to add?
No, I thought it was good. I would again echo your points of like if you find yourself like mocking everything and to the point where you're not actually testing anything, you're simply testing whether or not mock works. It's kind of time to step back a little bit and reevaluate what you're testing. A perfect example, like there's a lot of our existing tests, a lot of our existing integration tests are doing simply that, and there's a lot of work to do like in that regard, and especially with the SALT tests, just kind of rework a lot of those just poorly written tests.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if there's no other questions or comments, figured one of the best things that we could do is to just kind of work through some tests and actually writing some tests live. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And I want to be over here. So this board is probably familiar to many of you. This is one of the project boards here in the SALT project. It's the PRs to port to master. And if you go into this list here and you go to the this filter, you can do search by label, and you can say, I want ones that need test case. And this will give us a list of 52 PRs that are currently just waiting on tests for us to be able to actually port those to master. So if we go ahead and go to this pull request, yeah, see, you can see that it needs a port to master, and this one actually worked out because I was the one who wrote the original pull request. So this one was pretty simple and should be fairly straightforward to go ahead and write some tests for. So I'm going to go back to this original PR here, and it is 54599. So if you have never used this syntax, and one of the I'm going to kind of walk you through my workflow. Yours may be different. But one of the things I realized, if I had upstream and origin, that wasn't exactly clear which salt I was talking about. So I just went ahead and changed it so that salt is salt and Wayne is Wayne. So I'm never going to get confused and accidentally push things to the wrong fork. It's always that. So the way I do this is with a, okay. The Zoom bar is up at the top of my screen. So I'll do a Git Pull salt, and then you can pull an actual pull request with refs. As it pulls, oh wait, git fetch refs pull. Lost my copy. Git fetch salt refs. And then once you've pulled that particular head, then you can run git checkout fetch head, and that's just whatever the most recent fetch was that you made. So now, if I go ahead and look at the salt utils parser, 544. Yeah, so there's my git config file path, and the rest of my changes there. So what I'm going to do, let's see if we have tests, because there are some modules and places in Salt that we don't have tests, but ooh, hopefully we do. Let's check this out. Split tests unit, test parsers. No, I think that's utils. Utils test parsers. Sweet, there are tests. This is our process configurator. So it doesn't look like we're actually doing a process test on the process configurator function. So let's go ahead and start with that. Process configurator. And what I always like to do personally is just assert false when I'm first running my tests. That way, if they're like, I know for sure that my tests are running. And if you've never run tmux before, that's what I'm using here, terminal multiplexer. And now I should have this left over from a previous run. So tests unit utils test parsers dot py. And I want to test process configurator. Let's see if that runs. So you may have noticed this command here might not be one that you've ever run before. So I use fish shell, but you could do this with an alias. But I've created this this Docker image, Wayne W /salt sprints. And this just contains a master and a minion installation along with everything that you need to do to run tests. And then I have this big long line here of commands that I'm setting up for Docker. Basically, I want to mount my current directory within the Docker container so that I can actually run my tests against the existing whatever my current repository looks like. So that's what that does for me there. And now my tests have finished running. It looks like it took about 1 minute and 18 seconds to run the entire command here. This is something that Fish gives me. And it might go a little bit faster running a second time. I've noticed a little bit when it caches the, it seems to do something with Docker and caching that manages to make things go a little bit faster. So that was 13 seconds, which is much better. It is definitely still slower than running just locally, but the benefit here is that you don't have to worry about setting up environments and things. It's all isolated. It is a honking huge container or image. It's about 3 gigabytes, I think. I have a Debian one that's a little bit smaller, but it's still, I think, like 1.5 or 2.5 gigabytes. So it's pretty huge. I'm not entirely sure why that is, other than I'm installing a lot of things into these images. So it installs a bunch of other dependencies, but as it is, it's extremely useful for being able to like replicate issues and things without having to come up with a new salt minion and master. You can just run this container and spin it up and start doing stuff. Anyways, all of that aside, my tests are in fact working, which is great. I have this Vim macros, or some Vim stuff that I've set up to make running tests quite a bit easier. I want this guy as my command. So what that allows me to do is I can just hit enter, and then it will run my tests for me to make sure that everything is cool. So process configure. Let's see, config file name. So basically what we want to be testing here is, and then just to double check as well. Get this. So we had been implicitly replacing the comp file. Okay. Yeah, so there wasn't, behavior wasn't really documented before, and it didn't really give them any kind of information. So if it's, we want to make sure that when it is if it's not a file, that we get a warning message. Okay. So the way we are going to do that is make sure that we are config file name. So let's go ahead and mock us a file name. And what I'll usually do is check and see if there's any and it looks like we are creating a root dir here. So that's will be a handy place for us to do that. Root dir. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to say with patch Sobules. Parsers. This is a config.dir mixin. Git config file path. Test processing. Config file there. I don't know that we have a standard practice here, but I like to follow the, not sure if it's the BDD style of naming, but basically this right here. So test process config dir when config file is a dir, it should warn. So you can like read that test and get a pretty good understanding of what the test should be doing here. And then I'm just mocking this call out and saying, hey, go ahead and return the this root dir because we've already got it. We already know it's a directory. So I don't have to do anything like creating a directory. I've already got it on hand. And that will, that should make sure that we're returning that directory. And then what I need to do here is I'm probably going to need to patch sys.standard error so that I can catch this write call, or I guess probably just the standard error write, and then just assert that this is getting called with this particular expected warning message. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And when I find myself patching more than one thing, especially if it's long, you can nest decorators, but I don't like to do that because it ends out with, you know, you get this whole arrowhead pattern and that's gross. So I will usually change this to patch config path patch there. And you may have noticed this little tidbit here, this auto spec equals true. If you have never run, or if you're not familiar with patch, this auto spec true is super handy. Basically what it will do is it will tell mock to make sure that this patch has the correct arguments. Without it, by default, it just returns a magic mock. And so you can basically do anything. So you could do you could write code like that, and it would happily go ahead and mock that out, and you wouldn't get any error. But by doing auto spec, this would actually fail because these are not valid keyword arguments for the write call. So once I've got that, I can do this patch git config path, patch and air as fake bright. And I'm using this as because I need to actually assert that it was called with what I expected it to be called with. So now I should be able to do salt utils parsers. Process configure. I need to call that. Salt key option parser. Process configure. So, it's interesting. I don't see this actually being called. Look at this. Let me see here. Okay, well, let's see if I can go ahead and work with these guys here. Okay. Is it this? So maybe. Let's- Well, I'm back again.
Yeah, I was like, what happened?
Did everybody just get kicked?
No,
Yeah, that was
that's kind of interesting.
Yay, technology.
apparently my internet connection is unstable. Must be all of everybody else on Zoom.
Yeah, mine is as well, so.
Maybe it's Zoom that's unstable.
Something's unstable.
Yes.
We had a meeting at the beginning of the week, and boy, talk about the audio being laggy and bouncing all over the place. So I guess Zoom is the new toy of everybody remote.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it looks like we've only got about 5 minutes left here. And I didn't really have or I don't really have enough time probably to finish that particular test. But at least that kind of gives you a, I guess, a flavor for how one might start writing tests. And it's been, you know, only, let's see, when was this? Originally merged back in March of last year. So it's only been about a year since I've looked at that particular code. And I hadn't even, you know, wrote tests at the time. So just digging into it and figuring out where I need to, what I need to call, or what class I need to create that will actually make that call. Yeah, I think that is absolutely correct. Nick just mentioned that just having a dedicated session for a testing workshop. And for sure too, another thing, if you have, if you've got code that you're like, I'd love to write some tests for this, but I don't even know where to start. That would be, you know, absolutely bring those. We have talked about holding some other and even periodic test clinics. So I think that that would actually be a really good thing for us to start doing, because there's a lot of things with tests, you know, different pitfalls and challenges, and you know, we're all in this. We're all learning together how to test and how to better test. And something I didn't mention before, but I think is probably a good thing to close with, is why we even write tests, right? If we are just writing tests because it's a good thing to do, or at least that's what we've read and heard, or because other people tell us that we need to write tests, that's just cargo cult testing. You know, it doesn't really benefit us. The reason that we write tests is because we want to ship the best, most bug-free salt that we can. That's why we write tests, is because we all love salt. We all want to make salt the best product it can be. And the way to do that is with tests. Testing makes it so that we can, you know, it gives us confidence, right? If I have well-tested code and I make changes to that code and my tests don't break, that's a good sign that that my change was valid. If I make changes and the test breaks, and it breaks in the right way and says, "Hey, dummy, you broke this code," then it's like, "Oh yeah, I totally should have thought about that." Then the tests are super valid and super valuable. So as you're writing tests, just keep that in mind. The idea that as I'm writing these tests, I want to make Salt the most bug-free, awesome piece of software that I can, and writing tests are going to help me with that. And you know, sometimes testing is hard, sometimes it's awkward, sometimes it's like, well, why was this even written in this way? And that's actually one of the benefits of testing too, because more than once I've been writing code and I've written tests, and as I'm writing my tests, I realize I should refactor this code. I should restructure it entirely, because the way I'm writing it now, it's just so tightly coupled and wound up that it's not easy to test. And when that code is easier to test, it typically becomes better code. But I think we're out of time there, so I'll just end it with, or at least end my section with that. And I guess if you've got any questions, feel free to hit me up, either on Slack or IRC or somewhere else.
Thank you, Wayne. And the next testing working group meets April 8th. So if people want to talk about testing more, I see your suggestion here, Nick, as well, about doing a dedicated session for the testing workshop. We may wind up just brainstorming here, but that might be something that would make sense for us to stream on Twitch as well. So we'll look at ways to do more kind of reviews of tests and have people see how those work. And like I said, testing workshop is the 8th of April, and there is a testing channel in Slack as well. I don't have anything else. Thank you all for joining me, and enjoy the rest of your day.